If you have a plant disease or an insect problem, doing cover crops and that residue on the soil may be an issue. Rotating your crops is key to making a cover crop system work correctly. If you are leaving diseased or insect-infested plant material in the field, it's going to make your next season worse. So you want to make sure if you're having an issue that that plant material is removed from the field, but the material that we'll be talking about that we're going to till back in or leave on the surface, understand that that needs to be clean as far as so you're not rotating problems back through. So historically in agriculture, the clean tilled fields were kind of the norm for about 50 years. And a lot of our soils were heavily used. And so a lot of the nutrients that were there have been used up. We need to think about replacing those. So the clean tillage did have a purpose: weed control, moisture management, and aerating the soil. But our soils here in Oklahoma only have an organic matter content of about 0.5%. So in northern states, their organic matter persists a little longer because their temperatures are lower. Because we have higher temperatures, ours breaks down faster when you're thinking about that cycle of nutrients. So when our organic matter is that low, it causes problems with the way our soil works. When we have rainfall, the water doesn't penetrate the soil profile very well. And then it also, it doesn't hold the water, it doesn't hold nutrients because there aren't correct air spaces, the structure of the soil has been damaged. So basically your cover crops are going to be growing that organic matter in place. So how many of you have used wheat straw to mulch a garden? That's something you can do. If you're strictly organic, where are you gonna buy organic wheat straw? That's gonna be something that, you kind of, if you really think about it. So cover crops are, kind of back up a minute. It's going to be growing something in your off season. And a really easy way to illustrate that is when we built our house, we moved in the first week of November. A lot of dirt work, the ground was bare. We needed to cover that soil. Full sun, we needed something on the soil. You can't plant Bermuda grass in November. So thinking about the time of year, we planted wheat. We had a beautiful green yard. It anchored the soil. It protected from wind erosion. It protected from rain erosion. And so it held our soil in place. So those concepts with cover crops also come into play. If you grow it in place, you don't have to, you do have to process it. We'll get to that part. But you're not composting it, you're not turning it. It's going to be managing that kind of on-site and in place. So in some cases, it can be less work, but you need to know what you're planting and how you're going to manage it on the end of that cover crop as well. I'm not saying there's not any work to it. We'll get to that part. So benefits, you can reduce the amount of inputs of fertilizer, sometimes herbicides, and then other pesticides because you're increasing the beneficial things that are happening in your soil. The mycelial growth from the root development. By using legumes in this system, you can add nitrogen and fixed nitrogen that you'll be adding back into the soil. And then also the bacterial makeup. And if you have compost or even manure that you're adding to your garden, that's not instantly ready for the plant to use. Bacteria and different chemical processes have to happen. We're not going to go into all that chemistry part of that tonight. I'm not a soil chemist, but kind of understand there's so many different processes, and you could have a whole list of chemical reactions that are actually taking place from something as simple as manure into nitrogen that the plant can use. Like we kind of already mentioned, the protecting that soil surface, it's like a cover. Cover crop is basically that. You're covering that soil where it's not bare to the elements during the off season. So it's going to help hold the soil together and really protect those crops. This is a photo from the Perkins Research Station, and it's showing a cover crop of, I believe this one, I mean, it's a clover, it may be mixed with something else too, and the brassicas, they strip-tilled the field, so leaving a strip of cover crop, and then they come in and plant the brassicas, and in Stillwater in the spring, you're going to get quite a bit of north wind coming through there. You get some wind protection for those tender plants besides fixing the nitrogen, and so there's a lot of benefits, and this was just a really pretty picture. So anytime we improve our soil, we increase our organic matter, we're increasing the filtration of the water into the soil, so when we do get rainfall, it can be absorbed and used there in the field. We are cycling those nutrients back through the plants and into that soil, and even if you are adding fertilizer, then there's less risk of that running off down the street, running into the ditches and streams. You're keeping that nutrition in the field, even though it may be inside of a plant for the moment. This visual just kind of shows the tops and the bottoms. A lot of times when we look at a field, we say, oh, what great tomatoes. We don't think about what's going on under the soil. So where all of these roots are growing, you're going to have little channels, and say if this is left in the field and over the winter, as those roots deteriorate and compost basically in the field, you're going to have little channels, and that's where water can be absorbed, water can move, and you're really creating air spaces as those break down where your chemistry can kind of happen. With your different products that you may be growing, legumes are going to break down faster than some of your grasses, and so there's different sources and different reasons for different nutrients. One of the handouts that you have is on crop rotation. It's actually from the University of Wisconsin. On the back side of their fact sheet, it lists the plant families. So as we talk about crop rotation, in a garden system, you don't want to plant tomatoes in the same place every year. For disease problems and insect problems as well, you want to rotate on a 3 to 5 year rotation if possible. Sometimes our space limits that. We may not have enough space to be able to do that. And sometimes even if we have nematodes or an issue that's a problem, don't forget about containers. You could use Leon's bucket system containers for tomatoes for a few years if you have severe nematodes. We recommended that to one of our clients this year, and he had told me, he came in, he's like, I've got nematodes, I can't grow tomatoes. And I had some feed tubs out by the extension barn, and I was like, hey, and I started telling him about crop rotation first. And he said, ma'am, I don't have time. And he was an older gentleman, and I thought, well, you never know. And I was still trying to, and it was kind of one of my early clients, and I'm still trying to figure out how to convince him he needs to rotate crops. And come to find out, he had a medical issue, and he wasn't going to be able to rotate and get that done. So he was just thrilled to be able to have an idea, oh, I can plant these in a container and I can still grow tomatoes this year. So you never know where somebody's coming from sometimes, and finding a system that will work with your situation is really important when you're talking about cover crops. So nutrient management, this comes back to that nutrient cycle. The inputs that we put in there, they really benefit the soil system. Sometimes cover crops can be used with a grazing system. They can be used with things like wildlife. You can look at songbirds. If you have a market garden and you have a problem with wildlife in your area, you may not want to plant something that's going to attract them in the off-season. So really think about, how you're going to manage that property, and you don't want to create a worse problem by drawing them in, but it's something to consider. So when you're selecting your cover crop, you have winter and cool season. For gardeners, that's going to be a cool season cover crop, because in the summertime, you're going to be planting things that you can harvest. So we'll skip over that kind of today. The legumes, by being able, I'll kind of give you an example, like if in production agriculture, the best example is wheat, because we grow so much in Oklahoma. So in the summertime, after the wheat is harvested, many times they may come in and plant cowpeas or mung beans. That's a legume following a grass. And so when you have that rotation, both plants are going to use a little bit different nutrients. Your legume is going to put some nitrogen back in the soil, and so it really kind of helps benefit and get that balance. So for in the home garden, you can figure out your rotation and put in a legume or a root crop or tomatoes and peppers, and just go to a different plant family as you're rotating your plan. The deep-rooted cover crops would be like your forage radishes or your brassica family. Purple top turnips are one that can be used, and those help break up the soil if you have a compaction layer. Some of those radishes have a really deep root on them, and so that's going to kind of help break up a compaction layer if that's an issue. Back on the board that I have, I brought some seed samples so you can kind of see what those seeds look like. We talk about using a cover crop as a single plant. You could just do all wheat, or you could use a mix. But a lot of these, they're going to have different seed sizes. And if you're using a backpack rotary spreader and you're just going along and you have your seed mixed together, the bigger seed are going to fly farther. So you may end up with a bunch of Austrian winter peas on the outer edge, and your turnips are going to be right down the middle. So you may, if you have a small space, you may want to seed your Austrian winter peas, refill your bag, come back and reseed, seed your turnips. It's going to be a little more walking. You'll get a more uniform distribution of your seed if you seed them separately. If you're doing a market garden and you're talking acres, you're not going to want to go to that trouble. But if you're doing a small space, it can be really helpful. So this is a good picture to illustrate. This is a pumpkin crop. This was done on the Perkins Research Station. The top left photo was following a pea and clover mix. They planted in the fall, they mowed it in the spring, and they came in and planted. This will work well if you have a large seeded plant like pumpkins or squash or watermelons. If you're trying to grow a leafy lettuce or something, you probably are going to have to strip till to have that good seed to soil contact. But for your larger seeds, or if you're using transplants, then this is going to work better. So following a pea and clover mix, you can see how big those plants are. The photo on the right of the winter wheat, you can see the residue. It's basically like you're planting in your wheat straw that you just had grown in place. They come in and mow it, or you can use the roller crimper, like Steve had pictures of that equipment, and I didn't have a good photo of that, so I appreciate that. But they came in and planted this pumpkin crop. I may have said watermelon. Anyway, they look a lot alike at this point. So at harvest, you can see the picture, and you can see there's some grass there. I don't know if it's rye and wheat that kind of came up from the cover crop mix, or by that point of the season, you get your harvest in and go on. But you can see during the growing season there, you don't see a lot of weeds. By having that cover crop and that residue on the surface, they have the root systems are in the ground holding that soil in place, competing for that soil space, and then the mulch, the residue on the top of the ground is covering and helping a lot with weed control. So you can see for something like this, you can really get good control. You don't have to have a clean tilled path in between. Again, it's going to depend on what crops you're growing. The picture on the bottom there kind of shows them laying over a cover crop, and that's one way to do it. Commonly in a home garden, you are not going to have the equipment to do that, and so simply mowing and then planting through that. This is a field day that Dr. Brandenberger had attended in Colorado. It was a potato production, but they were able to greatly reduce their inputs by using cover crops. Now potatoes, and in Colorado, it's kind of like that cool weather. They have a different production cycle than we do, and so we don't have too many commercial potato growers here, but they were greatly able to reduce their inputs, and they had a lot of data that they collected from this study. They had increased diversity, like Tracy was talking about, so their insects, they did have some insect issues, but by having diversity in that from their cover crop, they were able to have more predator insects already there in place, and they did use theirs with compost and cover crops and a grazing animal system. For your seed for cover crops, you want to make sure you have a high quality seed. You want to make sure, anytime you're buying a quantity of seed, well, and it doesn't even have to be a large quantity, but it's going to have on there if it has weeds or how much different material from what is in there that's required on the label. So make sure that you're buying from a reputable company. You don't want to bring something in that is going to cause an issue. These can be pre-mixed. You can make your own custom blend. There's a lot of blends out there. Or you can just go with creating your own or even a single species. Depending on your goals, you can use grasses, you can use legumes, or maybe a mixture of both. Like some of the others have had, there's a lot of videos out there. If you go on YouTube or if you Google cover crops videos, you can come up with a lot of material. With that, I just like to say that kind of notice what part of the country they're in. Different concepts are going to work in different areas. But anything that's in the lower tier states, we have a lot of heat. The varieties may be different if they're talking about cover crops for up north. And their growing season is so short that they typically have their season and they may not be able to do quite as much with these. So this is a great way to enrich your soil. You can suppress weeds a lot. Rye is going to be one of your best cool season cover crops for weed control. And if you're doing a cover crop for weed control, you probably want to increase your seeding rate. You're not going to go by the regular, lawn or field rate, unless if you're doing a larger acreage, that might be a limiting factor. But in a home garden, you can increase those rates quite a bit and get better weed control. You don't want to have a cover crop that's going to have an insect pest that is similar to the crop that you will be growing. You do not want to provide that perfect situation of a food and a place for them to overwinter. So you want to make sure that you're going to a different plant choice, and so that you're rotating that to prevent overwintering. So for a typical garden, you would come in about 4 weeks before a killing frost. Now, if you were growing pumpkins or winter squash, you may kind of get a window there of, your cash crop may still be growing at the point where you kind of need to get your cover crop in. Your cash crop would always take priority there for your bottom line. So just an illustration of one thing we did. My daughter raised not sheep. My brain's tired. So she had goats and chickens and quail as part of her FFA project. My garden was kind of next to this area. We came in and seeded with Austrian winter peas, turnips, and cereal rye. And we were able to grow this in the garden, as a cover crop. And instead of turning the goats in, I didn't want to do that because I was going to be planting too quickly. But we were able to harvest, and my seeding rate on the turnips was fairly high. And so as we thinned those turnips, and they just kept growing, and we had fresh green material that we could feed our animals through the whole winter. This one year, the weather was good. A lot of times our weather and different things are going to come into play. We had a good planting time, and we had greens for our livestock all the way through February. So if you have a homestead garden and you have acreage where you have other animals and other things going on, your cover crop can actually be very beneficial. So it may, besides the soil aspect, you can have a lot of good uses for that as well. Terminating your cover crop, that could be by grazing, it could be by utilizing it that way. You can lay it down with a roller crimper. It's going to depend a lot on what you chose to grow. Mowing is going to be a common way to go ahead and take that crop down so that you can plant your cash crop. Sometimes they will use a chemical. Most of what we've been talking about was more on the less chemical side when you're talking about vegetable production, but sometimes they will come in with a chemical like Roundup or something and go ahead and burn the top of that cover crop, and then that is left in place. The roots are still there, but it takes care of it so that it's not competing with your plant material, your crop that you're growing. And so that residue, you can either till into the soil or you can leave it on the surface. So timing on this, you want to catch it when it's at 50% bloom so that it doesn't set seed, so that you don't have it continually coming up. I see some heads nodding here. So you do want to know what you're planting and how that crop cycles. You want to go ahead and mow that. In the spring, if you had wheat or rye, you may terminate that before it's mature. But that would either be like a green manure. You mow it, you till it into your soil, and that's going to need to be done about 3 weeks before you actually want to plant your crop. That way those soil systems and that breaking down can start to happen. Those nutrients can start their process of cycling back into the soil. This is at the OSU-OKC Organic Conference that I was talking about. This is in their demonstration garden. You can see Daniel was there. So they had grown tomatoes and peppers where this plastic is. And as I go to the next photo, this was their summer warm season cover crop. This had sun hemp, hay grazer. It had about 8 or 10 different varieties that they put in this. It had sunflowers and okra and mung beans. And so this one did get rather large. I mean, that's why I had the picture with the people. Next photo. You can see how tall that is. And so for a home gardener, if I were to go out and see that, I'd be like, oh dear. So you have to be able to mow and pull that down. But the amount of organic matter that they were able to grow in one season, so they were going to mow that, or the larger ones, some of the sun hemp had really large stems. And so they were going to actually have to run that through a chipper shredder in order to do that. But they were going to put all that organic matter, just lay it back in place right where it is, and let that compost on its own, and then that will be their planting bed for the next season. So this was done because they didn't have a project this summer. They wanted something there. If you have bare ground, something is going to grow. You may as well choose what that is. And so if you're doing a cover crop, now they could have picked something that only got, waist high. This one did grow incredibly, and so you can see how that would be kind of a project to tackle to get that broken down so it can go back into the soil. On the table back here, these are 2 publications that are put out by SARE. They are very helpful. They have a lot of information. If you're interested in doing cover crops, they're easy to read. They have a lot of examples of practical ways that this can be implemented. It shows how the managing cover crops profitably goes into even how a lot of our cover crops increase our diversity. They also help with our pollinators, our bees and our native bees that need a place to overwinter. And being able to have our pollinators and our parasitic insects in our diverse garden helps a lot with our controls that we're wanting to gain.